Welcome to the H-Files, where we bring you the most fascinating untold stories. I am Mr. Anda, and today's story is not for the faint-hearted. Every detail you will hear is based on actual events, making it all the more terrifying. And if you are someone who craves real-life horror stories, then this is the one for you. But beware, it's not for everyone. Only those brave enough to face their fears should tune in. And if you dare to watch it till the end, I guarantee that you will be left wanting to know more. Don't worry, you can easily find tons of information on the web to quench your curiosity. So hit that like and subscribe button. And if you have a story in mind that you'd like me to cover, leave a comment. And not only will I do the story for you, I promise to mention you by name. Okay, let's get into today's spine-chilling story. The chilly morning air sent shivers down Dr. Herman Mudgett's spine as he leisurely strolled down the deserted streets of Boston. The silence was deafening, and the emptiness of the streets made him feel uneasy. His mind was fixated on enjoying some eggs and coffee from his favorite local shop, but before he could even reach the end of the block, his world turned upside down. Two burly men appeared out of nowhere and collided with him with such force that he stumbled and fell to the ground. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, the men seized him by his arms and legs and shoved him into a covered carriage stopped beside them. Dr. Mudgett's heart raced as he realized he was being kidnapped. His mind went wild with the worst possible scenarios of what would happen next. Despite his efforts to resist, he was powerless against the strength of his abductors. The streets were left desolate, and the silence was only broken by the echo of the carriage's wheels and the clip-clop of horse hooves fading into the distance. The doctor had fallen prey to the ruthless act of kidnapping, taken away into the unknown with no idea of what lay ahead. The well-respected doctor's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. The ruckus outside was not a harmless prank, but a trap set by his captors, the dingy, rusted cage in the barely lit room they threw him into was not meant to keep him safe, but to imprison him. The sinister chuckle and menacing tone of his captors made it clear that they had been waiting for this moment for days. Dr. Mudgett trembled with fear as he overheard their conversation, and it sent chills down his spine. They were not just planning to harm him, but to kill him. The mere thought of it made him sick to his stomach, as a third voice emerged from the shadows, reminding the others they needed to wait for the boss. Dr. Mudgett couldn't help but wonder what kind of twisted organization was he dealing with. Mudgett was feeling a sense of terror that he had never experienced before. He knew that he was in a dangerous situation, and he desperately tried to appeal to the better angels of his captors. "Look, fellas, I'm a doctor," he said in a shaky voice. "If any of you are sick, I can help you. And I have some money I will gladly give you. I won't ask questions. I haven't even seen any of your faces." Mudgett's voice was trembling, but he kept his composure and appeared calm. He knew that any signs of agitation could provoke his captors into violence. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for any signs of hope. He prayed silently that his captors would see reason and let him go. He promised them that he would not say a word, and offered them extra money if they would release him unharmed. The two menacing men who had thrown him into the dark, dingy cage stared at him with a look of pure malice and hate before breaking into sinister laughter that echoed throughout the room. It was then that Dr. Mudgett realized he was trapped, with no way to escape the clutches of his captors. The thought of being left alone in that pitch-black cage, with no hope of rescue and no one to hear his screams, filled him with a bone-chilling dread that made his blood run cold. He knew then that he was in for a nightmarish ordeal, and the mere thought of it left him trembling with fear. As he tried to look around, he was instantly greeted by an overwhelming darkness that seemed to swallow him whole. The absence of light made it impossible for him to discern anything about this room. All he could hear was the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, and the unmistakable hissing and gnawing of what could only be rats. The musty smell of bad body odor, decay, and urine overwhelmed his senses, making him feel sick to his stomach. The cage he was in was small and cramped, and as he ran his hands along the bars, he could feel the rough, rusted surface of the metal. The walls of the room were made of stone, but they were damp and slimy to the touch, making him feel as if he was being swallowed by the very walls that surrounded him. He cautiously stepped around the cage, trying to determine its size. After counting his steps, he estimated that it was about 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. In the corner, he spotted a bucket that he presumed was meant to be his bathroom, and the whole situation made him feel trapped and helpless, as if the darkness and the rats were closing in on him, threatening to take him away forever. The horror of the situation was too much to bear, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of twisted, sadistic mind could have created such a dark and foreboding place. But things were about to get much worse for Dr. Mudgett. He had only been in that room for a few hours when 2 of his captors came in, opened the door, and took turns beating him badly. Being a doctor, he knew they did not break any bones, but they certainly bruised several of his ribs. Every time he tried to ask, "Why are you doing this to me?" they hit him harder. When he could no longer stand up, they viciously pulled him up by his hair, wrapped him in chains, pinning his hands to his sides, and placed a black canvas bag over his head. He was certain this was the end. They dragged him out of the room. He was unable to see anything with the bag blinding his sight, but he could tell by the temperature drop and the crisp smell of ozone that they were taking him outside. He could hear a horse close by, and then he heard a carriage door open. His 2 captors picked him up and tossed him like a rag doll onto the floor of the carriage, and then both men stepped in, sat down, and used the doctor as a footrest. He had lost all sense of time and space, trapped in the carriage and at the mercy of his captors. Suddenly the carriage came to an abrupt halt, and he heard eerie whispers and strange noises coming from outside. He strained to listen as the voices were getting closer and closer, and seemed to be speaking a type of English he couldn't understand. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, as he realized that his nightmare just grew much darker. As his 2 captors climbed down from the carriage, they took turns kicking and stepping on him, and the other men who had just approached seemed to be laughing about it. They pulled him out of the carriage like a sack of potatoes and let him hit the ground. He heard a voice that made his blood run cold.
"Good afternoon, Dr. Mudgett. I hope your ride here wasn't too terribly unpleasant,"
the voice said, with a hint of malice. He recognized the voices of his captors, who snickered but went quiet as the man spoke. He thought this gentleman must be their boss, the one the men had talked about, but he wasn't sure if this man was his savior or his doom. The voice instructed his captors to take him inside, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. They didn't know what awaited him. Wherever they were about to take him, the voice continued,
"Get him cleaned up, give him some warm food, and show him to his new home away from home. He's going to meet the boss tomorrow, and we want him to look presentable, don't we?"
The words were laced with an ominous tone.
"Have a good night, Dr. Mudgett. We will speak again soon."
Dr. Mudgett was taken to a large room the following morning, packed with all kinds of people, and he was asked to take a seat. Before he could even take in his surroundings, an older man with graying hair, wearing a long flowing black robe, walked into the room and took the seat at the very front. Mudgett was startled when a group of people across from him started requesting that he be put to death, and the majority of the room seemed to be in agreement. The doctor felt a chill run down his spine, wondering what kind of cult he had stumbled upon. The boss looked over at the doctor and asked if he had anyone to speak for him. However, Mudgett knew he could not trust anyone in the room, so he decided to speak for himself. The arguments began, and it soon became clear that the doctor was losing. The boss turned to a small group of people standing at the side of the room and asked if they had reached a decision on Mudgett's fate. Instantly, they replied that they had. It was unanimously decided that the doctor should be put to death. The boss nodded in approval and looked at the doctor with a stern expression, saying, "I hereby order you to be hung by your neck until dead." And the room erupted in applause, leaving the doctor stunned and struggling to make sense of what just happened. He was confined to a small, dark cage for a period of several weeks, waiting for his inevitable fate to come. Finally, on the morning of May 7th, he was given a final meal of his choosing. Despite the circumstances, he still had a hankering for eggs, the one thing he missed the chance to enjoy when he was kidnapped. He ordered a plate of boiled eggs, toast with butter, and a cup of hot coffee. He savored every bite and sip, knowing it would be his last. After he finished his meal, he was escorted outside, where a group of 60 people had gathered to watch him die. The air was tense and quiet. He tried to remain calm and collected, but his heart was racing, and his hands were trembling. He knew what would happen, but he didn't know how it would feel. He was escorted up the scaffolding, where the hangman placed a black velvet bag over his head and then began to fit the rope around his neck. He seemed to be having a problem getting it tight enough when Dr. Mudgett proclaimed, and I quote, "Take your time, I'm in no hurry." After finally securing the rope in place, the hangman pulled the lever at 10-12. Dr. Mudgett instantly dropped through the trap door with a sudden jolt around the base of his neck, but it took another 20 minutes for him to die. He hung there suffocating until his heart finally stopped beating. 2 friends were among the 60 people present at Dr. Mudgett's hanging. They were discussing the case. The question was posed, "I really don't know anything about this guy. Who is Dr. Mudgett?" His friend began to lay it all out for him. Herman Mudgett was his birth name, but he legally changed it to Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes for short. Holmes arrived in Chicago in 1885. He became interested in a drugstore located at 63rd and Wallace and tricked the owner into selling him the property. Afterward, he constructed a 3-story building right across the street from the drugstore. The first floor of the building served as a retail space, while the upper floors were used for apartments. In 1891, he turned the building into a hotel, later dubbed the Murder Castle, for folks coming to the World's Fair. Holmes lured unsuspecting fairgoers, usually women and laborers, to the hotel and gave them certain special rooms. These rooms were set up with secret piping so he could gas them to sleep. Trapdoor would open, and the innocent person would be dropped down a slide to the basement, where he would strap them down, torture, and eventually kill them. He built a crematorium disguised as a kiln, which he used to dispose of his victims' bodies. But he also used vats of acid to dissolve the body parts, as well as bind them into cement blocks and drop them in the Chicago River. Of course, one of his favorites was to clean the bones and sell the skeleton to medical schools. When the fair ended in 1893, he left Chicago, pulling scams with his associate, Pizzle. The 2 men devised a plan to pull off a life insurance scam, with Pizzle faking his own death and splitting the $10,000 policy with Holmes, till Holmes decided to kill him in Philadelphia for real and keep all the money. Directly after that, he murdered Pizzle's 2 daughters by locking them in a trunk and gassing them to death. He was arrested by Pinkerton agents in Boston on the morning of November 17, 1894. They transported him here to Philadelphia and housed him in Moyamensing Prison. Judge Arnold presided over the case, and he was found guilty of murdering the Pizzle family. It's such a shame that the hundreds of other innocent people he murdered cannot get the same justice. Do you know they even think he was Jack the Ripper? It is believed he was in Whitechapel, London in 1888 during the Ripper murders. Go figure, America's first serial killer may actually have also been Jack the Ripper. The exact number of unfortunate souls murdered by Holmes will never be known, but it is estimated to be well over 200. When asked if he had any last words before being put to death, he replied, and I quote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." He did request to be buried 10 feet deep and have a concrete slab poured over him, as he was afraid of grave robbers. He was buried in Section 15 of the Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed today's story, please don't hesitate to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you have a story you'd like me to do, just let me know in the comments. Next week's episode, titled Through the Jaws of Death, was specially requested by one of our subscribers, Scooter C. So be sure to tune in. It's going to be an unforgettable experience. See you next time.